for parents, we want to endlessly kind of pour energy into our kids, and we do let ourselves become depleted. We skip the gym or we skip the things that we need to take care of ourselves. I think the piece that we miss is that when we're not getting that energy in, the energy that's flowing out becomes degraded also. So, what we're putting into our kids actually kind of isn't as high quality when we are not getting that energy flow in that we need.
Welcome to Passion Struck. Hi, I'm your host, John R. Miles, and on the show, we decipher the secrets, tips, and guidance of the world's most inspiring people and turn their wisdom into practical advice for you and those around you. Our mission is to help you unlock the power of intentionality so that you can become the best version of yourself. If you're new to the show, I offer advice and answer listener questions on Fridays. We have long-form interviews the rest of the week with guests ranging from astronauts to authors, CEOs, creators, innovators, scientists, military leaders, visionaries, and athletes. Now, let's go out there and become Passion Struck. I am absolutely thrilled today to welcome Dr. Corinne Low to Passion Struck. Hey, Corinne, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, John.
I am so glad that we were able to move this interview up because we've been discussing it for a while and we had a clear break. So I'm glad we could do this today. It's so nice to finally get to meet you in person.
Yeah, it's so nice to get to meet you.
I want to start out with this whole idea that I think more and more of us today are feeling exhausted. And we don't know where this exhaustion is coming from. But I think so many of us feel like we're doing everything right, but we're still feeling this depletion. What do you think is really driving this exhaustion?
I think when you look at the data, the world is asking more of us because we went from a model of division of labor where in the mid-century, men were focusing on market production, women were focusing on home production, and nobody was spending very much time with their children. You've had one domain to measure your self-worth against and to try to put your time and energy into. We had this labor force revolution in women entering the workforce, but we really didn't solve for what happens at home. How do all of those things that we call adulting get done? The fact that you've got to keep up with the mail, the car needs repaired, you got to both take the dishes out of the dishwasher and put them back in again. And if you want there to be food in the refrigerator, you have to go to the grocery store. And if you want there to be dinner on the table, you have to cook it. And on top of that, the time we spend with our children has doubled. Parents today spend twice as much time with their kids as parents' generation ago. And it's so much so that actually working moms and dads spend more time with their kids today than stay-at-home moms did in 1975. And the labor force, our careers, they're not letting up either because we have what Nobel Prize winning economist Claudia Golden calls greedy jobs, where they don't just want the 40 hours a week, they want the 80 hours a week, right? They want your nights and your weekends because under capitalism, that's going to make them more money. So every domain is asking more of us. And is it any wonder then that we're tremendously depleted?
I remember my time as a senior executive at Dell is where I probably felt this the worst because out of my team, which had thousands of members in it, about 90% of them were in five other continents. And so what would happen is I was waking up like 4:30 in the morning. I was logging on because I was trying to have conversations with people who were in Asia, and then the Europe market would kick in. And then afterwards, I'd get home, do a few things with the family. And before I knew it, I was back on with the Asian teams because I had so many employees in Japan,
Mhm.
India, Malaysia, and China. And it's just after a while unattainable because
Yes.
there is no time to rest.
Right. And if you're working around the clock, as you said, how does the rest of your to do list get done? And then when we have that feeling of being constantly behind and not on top of things, that is so depleting to our energy and to our sense of wholeness, because I think we have that craving as humans to finish the job. And if the job can never be finished, right? We never get that closure. We never get that sense of satisfaction that we're chasing. And we don't get it in either domain, because I've got a pile of unfolded laundry and a pile of unanswered emails.
Yes. In your book, which we're going to be discussing today, which is titled Having It All, one of the things that you discuss was how when you had your child, you were having to do a 2 hour commute on top of everything else that was going on with the family and everything else. Could you bring us back to that time period and what this showed you about having to stack all these things on top of each other?
Yeah, well, I say in the book that I gave birth to my son and also a midlife crisis, because everything that I had stacked on top of each other and was balancing stopped balancing when I suddenly had an infant at home. So that commute felt like it could work, right? When I didn't have an infant, but then suddenly when I have a breastfeeding infant and I'm pumping in the Amtrak bathroom, it felt like it wasn't adding up at all. And that sense of incompleteness in both domains, I felt like I was falling behind my colleagues at work. I wasn't keeping up. I wasn't publishing enough papers. I might not get tenure. I was on the tenure track at Wharton. And then meanwhile, I felt like I was missing things at home. I was missing bedtimes. I was missing mornings and little cute things that they do with the daycare and those moments that were passing me by. And every time I would come home, it would feel like, okay, now there's tons of dishes in the sink and there's tons of laundry to do and there's packages that need to be returned. And it just felt like a never ending treadmill. And in that all, I really felt like I was losing myself, my fundamental sense of self, with my identity being a person who was like on top of things and who was successful and was able to set goals and achieve them. And suddenly it was all truly too much for one person to take on.
And I know your research has a lot of focus on women, but I think this feeling of overwhelmed, as I
Yeah.
described with myself, is gender neutral. And what I think is it's actually a structural problem with modern life. And I think that's something you agree with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. That I think there are these structural features, like I said, of workplaces demanding more, of us spending more time with kids, and there being no more juice to squeeze from time saving home technologies that lifted the burden for our parents' generation. They said, oh, suddenly I can pop something in the microwave so I can stay a little bit later at work. But we don't have any more technology that actually can take over some of these routine day to day tasks and some of the deeper work that isn't routine. It's very hard to outsource, which is emotionally processing things with your child or putting them to bed, right?
Yeah.
There's no one that can replace you in those moments. So I think there's a lot of things that are impacting both men and women. And I think one of the things that I do hear from women more, and I mentioned it myself, is that the guilt or the feeling of not enoughness in the home domain sometimes weighs heavier on women. Conversely, I sometimes hear from men that that feeling of not enoughness in the career domain may weigh heavier on them, right? That kind of feeling of I need to achieve or I need to accomplish or it means I'm not good enough in some way.
I think there's definitely a lot of that going on. I think from a structural standpoint, the other thing I found is even your children's schools are asking for constraints of your time. I know for
Yeah.
us, to get our kids into either a private school or a magnet type school or a fundamental school type of environment, there are requirements that they put on the parents for how much
Mhm.
time they're willing to invest
Mhm.
in the school. And if you've got two working parents,
Yeah.
it's just such a barrier. Plus everything you've got to do after school and the after school commitments that also hit you, etc. So
Travel, soccer, and
yes,
hockey, and oh my goodness, yes.
to me, the structural elements are at work, but they go
Yeah.
far beyond work. And oftentimes we don't even realize that even when we sign up to volunteer or to be part of church groups or other things, there tends to be far more commitments that come to it than first meet the eye. So I have been doing a lot of interviews lately, and one of around my new book, The Mattering Effect. And one of those was with Barry Schwartz, who I'm sure you have probably know personally. And he and I were really talking about why he, I think, doesn't like rational choice theory because it's putting so many constraints on people's choices. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think are some of the biggest constraints that people don't even realize they're making that are shaping their choices?
Oh, such a great question because I think there's the actual constraints, right? Which are things like you have finite time and money, and there are trade offs in the world that if you choose to put more time into work, then you have less time for your kids. And if you choose to put time into your kids' schools, you have less time for your personal life and going to the gym, right? So there's real constraints. And then there's these forces that shape our choices that sometimes people think are constraints, but they're actually preferences or their norms or their obligations or expectations. So it's, well, I have to volunteer at the school because otherwise everybody's going to judge me. And it's like, well, that's actually a preference. It's a preference for not feeling judged, right? There's also the forces of evolution. So in economics, we distinguish between the things that actually increase your well being and the things that humans might think increase their well being and therefore choose to do, but don't actually increase their well being. You can think of it as if I could put a type of candy in front of you that you don't even like. And you might, if you're sitting working at your desk, you might mindlessly eat it because, our brains have this old programming from millions of years of evolution that says, hey, if there's a calorie available, that calorie should be consumed because you don't know when you're going to get one again, right? And we know that is maladaptive in our now like nutrient rich environment that we now exist in, right? Well, the same is true for other choices that we make with things like our time. One of the things we talked about is like volunteering at church. And for our genes, being liked by other people was a survival strategy because you had to keep your community happy with you and build those relationships so that they would share food with you during the winter, right? But right now, whether or not you're the world's best church volunteer isn't going to determine whether you survive the famine. But your genes sometimes can still feel like it will and say, like, this, John, this is an existential threat if somebody's unhappy with you or someone's disappointed with you. And so, again, that can cause us to make choices out of guilt, out of a sense of social obligation, out of a sense of keeping up with the Joneses, because that social status protected us in a much more violent and less secure world or environment that our genes evolved in. But that's, again, maladaptive now when so many things need our time and so few things are really about survival. But making those choices under the threat of survival can actually limit our thriving because we're always chasing that being okay, making everybody else happy, and we're not finding what we really value or what brings us to our kind of highest state of existing.
And I think that last thing you said is extremely important because when you're under this constant feeling of responsibility and then you don't get any relief, it, at least for me, had a major compounding effect.
Mm.
And I don't even think at the time I really realized it was happening because it's one of those things, the responsibility starts building up and you realize it. But then after that, especially when you have kids, it subtly becomes more and more additional burden. But it's slight burdens that are increasing, or you realize that all of a sudden it's become overwhelming.
Oh, it's death by a thousand cuts.
How do you think when this is happening, it impacts how people experience energy day to day?
I think what I was feeling was that sense of depletion of all of your energy going out and nothing coming back, nothing filling your cup up, right? Nothing nourishing you. And one of the things that I note, and as you said, my book focuses on women, but this experience is more universal, is that for parents, we want to endlessly pour energy into our kids and we do let ourselves become depleted. We skip the gym or we skip the things that we need to take care of ourselves. I think the piece that we miss is that when we're not getting that energy in, the energy that's flowing out becomes degraded also. So, what we're putting into our kids actually isn't as high quality
Yeah.
when we are not getting that energy flow in that we need. And I think that's important because otherwise, parents feel like selfish, right? When they're like, oh, I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to skip doing the breakfast in the morning routine and the school drop off twice a week or whatever. Or, oh, I'm going to set a limit that says, look, sweetie, you got to pick one sport. It can either be soccer or hockey. It can't be both because we can't drive in 3 different directions 6 days a week. And we feel like selfish, right? But I think what that misses is that your kid doesn't see the bigger picture. The same way your kid is always going to ask for one more episode of TV or an extra dessert or whatever. And you're going to set limits. That's your job as a parent because you see the bigger picture. And if you zoom out, you can see the picture that says, if I keep letting the energy flow out, the quality of it is going to go down. And therefore, the time that I spend with my child that's most important for their human capital development, that's the economist term for kids' knowledge and their leadership skills and everything that they're going to take into the labor force. The things that are so important for their human capital development are the relationship with you, the connected time with you, the ability to discuss things with you as a parent. And I really saw that with my son, that when I made choices that protected my energy a little bit, and I made some big changes in my life, you can read about them in the book, that our relationship actually blossomed because I was able to be present with him. I was able to be the kind of parent that he needed. So there's a reason the rule is put your oxygen mask on first. It's not because the parent's more important. It's because you might pass out and not be able to put the kid's oxygen mask on if you don't take care of yourself first. And I just think that's something that's so important for parents to keep in mind.
Corinne, I want to use that oxygen mask theory here for a second because in my book, when I describe mattering, I describe it like oxygen. To me, there are certain things that psychologically we need safety, we need love, and I feel like we need to have the need to matter. And if that need to matter is like oxygen and finally we're cut off from it, I think it's the same thing that you're alluding to with the oxygen mask. We start getting depleted of it, and all of a sudden, it then starts having unimaginable consequences that we never thought of. And when I was talking to Gordon Flett about this, I was asking him about loneliness and burnout and hopelessness and rising anxiety. And I asked him, do you think these things are all related? And his term is antimattering. Do you think antimattering is at the root of it? And he said his research was, in his opinion, yes, this is the major cause and those are symptoms of it. If you think about that analogy with the oxygen, if mattering is like oxygen, do you think his premise has weight?
I think I haven't studied like that specific effect, right? But I think that is part of what I talk about in my work is that ourselves are the resource that we use to invest in these other areas of our life. And so if you just invest in your career, you just invest in your partner, you just invest in your kids, and you don't invest in yourself, each of those investments, right, is not actually going to pay off in the way that you think it is because you yourself are actually a scarce resource, your time and your energy. And so I do think it's very important to protect the self, the energy for the self, right?
Mm.
And to tap into what are the things that actually fill your cup? What are the things that replenish your oxygen supply? And to understand that when we do that, far from taking away from other people in our lives or other sources of that we could put our energy into, often you're going to end up replenishing those connections because if you are whole, then you are able to give, you are able to be present. That's the concept that I introduced in the book. It's an economics concept that kind of everybody's taken Econ 101 knows, this concept of the utility function. I think it's a similar thing to your mattering effect, which is that I tell people you need to tap into what you most deeply value and the things that give you utility. It's not about earning more money, but it's also not just about being happy. I think there's been some emphasis in the self-help literature on like happiness or joy. And I don't think that's everything that matters in life. Like one of the things I mentioned is that like one of the most valuable things you can do is sit by the side of a dying family member. And nobody would describe that as a happy or a joyful experience. Often you're sitting there crying. But it has tremendous value. It's something that you would never regret at the end of your life. And so utility, I define it as the things at the end of your life you would look back on and say, that is a life well lived. That's what I wanted to be doing, that brought me meaning, that brought me fulfillment. So utility includes taking care of your kids, taking care of loved ones, but it also just includes going for a hike on a spring day and smelling the way the air smells after the yucky weather of the winter has gone, right? Or after a rainstorm. So I think that concept, I think they have a lot in common of this, that fundamentally we need to tap into what matters to you. And that means tuning out a little bit of the messages that the world sends us about what we need to be whole. Because the world is going to say, you need a nice car, you need a nice house, you need to, if you're a woman, you need to like not be wrinkled and not age, you need to lose weight. And at the end of our life, again, when we think about this utility idea, often those are not the things that we would put weight on. So we've got to tune out the messages, right? The capitalistic, consumeristic messages that tell us to focus on those things. And we've got to tune into what actually matters to us and ultimately that makes us matter.
Yeah, Corinne, are you familiar with Professor Gilovich's work out of Cornell?
No, I'm not.
So he has been studying regret, like at people when they're in their third trimester of life,
Mm.
what do they regret the most? And his work is pretty eye-opening because it showed that 76% of them regret not living to become their ideal self. And now we could question, what does ideal self mean? Is that self-transcendence? Is that self-actualization?
Mhm.
But to me, if you think about the utility function that you brought up, I think it's those things that our future self would value that you accomplished. And when you look back, that you were proud that you took the time to do them, is how I see it.
Yeah.
Is that similar as how you would look at it?
Yeah, exactly.
So, what do you think are the keys for someone actually figuring out what their utility function is?
Great question. And one of the ways that I recommend people do it is by closing your eyes and picturing your life if money were no object, if you were a mega billionaire, what would your life look like? And I think for a lot of people, there's some material things, right? You'd be like, oh, I'd have a nicer house, or I would drive a nicer car, I would take lots of vacations. And then there's some things that are about how you spend your time that are like, oh, I wouldn't need to work so much, and so I would spend a lot of time visiting relatives that I don't get to see, and or I would spend a lot of quality time with my kids, and I wouldn't feel rushed or stressed or that I had to finish something. I would be really present with them, right? So, going through this exercise, and it's a little wistful because obviously you can't have that life. You can't just snap your fingers and make it happen, right? But it is revealing to you because that's the unconstrained maximization. In the real world, we're doing constrained maximization, but this still unlocks what you are ultimately trying to be maximizing. And it's often very telling to people because if you did this, John, for example, you would have never said, I would make sure to be on the phone with at 9 p.m. with Singapore.
Yeah.
You would never say that's something you're going to do. Again, if money is no object, if you don't face any constraints. And what that informs you is that it says, even people who love their jobs, I love my job, but if in that fantasy world, it'd say, yeah, but I would do it for like 10 hours a week, 15 hours a week. I wouldn't do it for 60 hours a week, right? Ultimately, we work because we get paid in money, and money buys other things that give us utility. It buys the things that you pictured, like the nice vacation that you need money to buy, right? But it's revealing about the things that you actually value. And then you can do the work. You can be a problem solver to be like, okay, that's what I value. How do I get more of it? And recognizing that if fundamentally a lot of what you were picturing was about control over your time, that you can make choices right now to say, well, then I'm going to make trade offs to invest less time into work because work is a tool we use to convert our time into money, and more time into those things that directly give me utility, that directly are important to me, that directly matter to me.
It's interesting, Corinne. I was having a discussion with Jamil Zaki, and we were talking about our worth. And It went along the lines of this whole personal utility function that oftentimes we don't even realize that our worth in some ways is being erased from us because I use it in this example. We were talking about that what we're living today is really a market of mattering, a mattering market. And what Jamil and I were really discussing is when people optimize for what society rewards rather than what actually makes them happy, it's like an increment at a time of your self worth that's
Mm.
erased. And when he and I were first talking about it, it was like the light bulb went off for me because that self worth gets optimized all the time in things we do that we don't even realize we're doing. And I realized this when I was in my late 30s, early 40s, because I was like, well, I keep coming into work, and one, I'm an introvert in an extrovert type of world. But two, I felt like I was optimizing so much of who I was to be productive at work and to show up in a way that would maximize my effectiveness in that work environment. But the more I started to look at it, it was almost like I was putting a mask on every day, hiding who I was underneath it and what was actually making me happy. Do you think that's a gap a lot of people are dealing with?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's so easy to lose sight of what's actually important to us because that's in everybody else's interests, right? Your job doesn't want you to think about what's most important for you. Your job wants you to think about how to be more productive, how to make them more money. And so they're going to put a lot of status incentives to make you feel like doing more for them is consistent with doing more for yourself. And you've got to actually recognize no, there's a gap there, right? That fundamentally our interests are not shared. And I want different things. And if I had complete control and freedom over my time, I might spend more time sitting on the beach or playing with my toddler than is actually in the interest of my company that's profit maximizing, right? So I think that's exactly right. And that's why it's important to take these moments to be really explicit and strategic in our own lives. The same way you do a quarterly plan at work or whatever, and you have to take that bird's eye view to sit down and say, is how I'm spending my time consistent with what brings me value? Am I actually maximizing here? Am I actually living life in a way that gets me as much utility as possible, acknowledging that I'm facing constraints and I can't just have infinite utility, but within those constraints, am I doing the best that I can?
Corinne, I want to park this whole idea of personal utility for a second, and I promise I'm going to come back to it. I want to go back to the concept of deals. A couple months ago, was speaking with Alex Emis, and we were talking about his book that he co authored with Nobel
Richard
laureate
Thaler.
Richard Thaler. And we were talking about this in terms of deals that we think about in economic terms where you're overpaying for things, and that's what causes the winner's curse.
Yep.
But I was hoping that you could talk about deals and how they impact our jobs, our
Mhm.
relationships, and our major life decisions, and what makes a good deal versus one
Mhm.
that is unsustainable.
Such a great question. And Alex is my neighbor and a good friend, and I love his book, so everybody should pick it up. But I think what's different about those deals in our relationships, in our jobs, versus the deals that we make about financial matters is it's much less explicit that there is a deal happening at all. And so often you fall into a deal that you then realize you're like, wait a minute, this does not add up. This is a bad deal. I give the example in the book, and it was something I lived through of women winning the bread and baking it too in their relationships. That we often see in the data that when a man earns more, the woman, his wife, does more home production. They do more of the cooking and the
Yeah.
cleaning. They do more of the childcare. But when a woman earns more, she still does more of the cooking and cleaning and the childcare. And that's what I call winning the bread and baking it too. And you don't sign up for that. You don't make that explicit, right? It's that you get married. In my case, we had equal earning power when we got married. And then he at some point decided to leave his job and kind of try to start a business, had some setbacks doing that. I happened to, after I went to grad school, get a really good job at Wharton. And so it just started happening that an earnings gap opened up. And then because of some gender roles and some defaults, I was more of the primary parent and I was doing more at home. And I never would have negotiated that deal for myself, right? If it was made explicit, if it was like, hey, okay, does this arrangement work for you? I would have never negotiated that deal. But you don't negotiate it. You just fall into it. And then you open your eyes and you're like, wait a minute. And the same can happen at work, right? I know women who, right out of college, they said, I want to make a difference. And so they went into a passion field. They went into labor organizing, or they went into a nonprofit, or they went into the arts or media. And they said, I'm willing to struggle because I want to be in this field. I want to make a difference. But then at some point, they realized, wait a minute, my employer is taking everything from me and I'm getting this fulfillment back, but I'm not getting rewarded in money. And now I'm falling behind my peers. I can't afford to buy a home. I can't afford to feel like I have financial stability. And that amount of fulfillment I'm getting from my employer, it's not worth it. And I've seen some of those women choose to move into a more transactional career where they say, okay, I'm going to move into something where I clock in and I clock out. And then I'm going to volunteer on the side and get my fulfillment there. I'm going to spend time with my kids and get my fulfillment there. I think what's different about the types of deals that Alex is talking about and the types of deals that I write about is that often we're not aware that we're making those deals, right? We don't think of it as there's terms of this agreement. And that's why I think it's important to actually zoom out and be like, what are the terms of this agreement? What is the balance of trade with my employer, right? How much am I giving and how much am I getting? And the same in marriages, the same in friendships, right? If there are friendships where you say, hey, every single time I'm the one chasing down to make plans, or every single time I'm the one coming to the rescue, just recognizing, where am I putting in more energy than I'm getting back?
Yeah, it's a person who's in a family ecosystem where,
Mm.
if you think about this as the analogy of a house, all of a sudden they become the floor that everyone is
Yeah, yeah,
stomping
yeah.
on, or they become the refrigerator that's out in the garage, serves a purpose, but doesn't really get any constant
Yeah.
love and caring, right?
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that goes on in society is so many smart, capable people stay in bad deals for a very long time,
Yeah.
whether
Yeah.
that's at work or at home, as you were just describing. What do you think are some of the early warning signs that one of those deals or life arrangement is costing you more than it's giving you?
One of the things that I think I should have recognized earlier in that bad deal that I was in was that when somebody needed to make a sacrifice or make a compromise, it was always me, right? That's if something feels one sided, where, for example, your firm is asking you to kill yourself and stay up all night and finish something because there's an emergency or bail somebody else out. But then when you have an emergency, you don't get that grace, right? Where they're like, I get it that you couldn't meet this deadline, or I get it that you need to take this time off to be with a family member or something like that. So when something is one sided and only one person is making sacrifices, I think that's definitely a warning sign. When something is leaving you depleted. So if you are just unhappy all the time, and if you're constantly feeling that lack of energy, that you're making a pro and con list. Should I quit this job or should I leave this relationship? I always say, if you're making a pro and con list, you already know the answer, because it shouldn't feel like that. Because when you're fulfilled, when you're where you're supposed to be, yes, things feel hard, but you also know that you have a foundation that's worth preserving, right? And that's the are are you making investments in people and institutions that are also making investments in you, right? And true community, true friendship is when okay, yes, you might sometimes be the person who does favors for somebody, who throws a party for them, who picks their kid up from school, who whatever, but that's also there for you. And sometimes for people who are chronic givers, you have to let yourself test that. You have to sometimes let yourself receive to recognize that some of that giving that you've been doing can come back to you, right? But if you know for a fact, you know that, okay, I have asked that person to step up for me. I have asked my job, I have asked my relationship to step up for me, and it wasn't there. I didn't get that same grace. I think that's a big red flag.
In your book, Having It All, frame all of this that life is a set of exchanges of
Yeah.
time, money,
Yeah.
energy, effort for a perceived payoff. So if we go back to what we were talking about with personal utility, and you think about the deals we were just talking about, how would us knowing our utility function shift or guide the big decisions or deals that we're making in our career, relationships, etc.? How would it make things different?
So in both of these, if you know that, you can map things over the arc of your life to in a way that's going to work for you. So I talk about this in relationships by saying when we're getting into relationships, we often think about those in the moment feelings. So we think about who makes a good boyfriend or girlfriend, but we don't think about who makes a good partner in the enterprise of having a shared life. And you do want to think about things like, do you have shared values about how much to invest in career versus how much time to invest in children or other pursuits? Just shared values about how much time to spend on leisure and enjoyment versus capitalistic productivity. Are you both going to be there? Are you both willing to make sacrifices where if I have a career opportunity in another city, you'd have to quit your job for me to take it? Is that reciprocal and not just an expectation that one person's going to sacrifice for the other person? So thinking about how you want your life to look and feel, and then thinking about if you're aligned. One of the mistakes I see people make is where at the time you get together, you're like both living in like a bare bones apartment with IKEA furniture. But like one person is picturing, I want to have a home with holiday traditions and I want it to have the Christmas tree decorated and stockings on the mantle. And I want to have it be carpeted and have paintings hung up and have nice furniture and whatever, and the other person is just like, this is fine, right? So that difference, that wide chasm between you has not been revealed because you're at this moment in life where you're both living this student young person lifestyle, but you've got to be able to mentally hit fast forward a little bit to where do you want to be in 20 years and see if you're lined up then. And the same is true in a career. As I said, I mentioned the people I know who've gone into passion fields because they said, yeah, right now in my 20s, this works for me and I want to feel like I'm making a difference. But you've got to mentally fast forward. Am I making investments in a career that's going to work for me when I've got young kids at home and I've got bills to pay? And is this choice that I'm making now, is this going to pay off then? Thinking about like, how can a career support you over the arc of your life? And that doesn't mean, I don't think you have it all figured out from the beginning. My first job out of college was McKinsey Consulting. I did not stay there, but it gave me a lot of human capital. It gave me a lot of those skills and leadership capabilities and knowledge that I could use in whatever my next job was. So you don't have to have it all mapped out, but you want to give yourself options for the future. You want to be building your durable, transferable human capital, which is more important than ever in the age of AI, because we really don't know what fields are going to exist 10 years from now, right? But things like your leadership skills, things like your ability to communicate, your resilience in the face of change, that's durable, transferable human capital. And so building that up is going to help you map out a career over the arc of your life. But I think that in both cases, relationships and career, it's really about mentally fast forwarding and remembering that your utility function is you looking back at 85 years old and asking, how are the choices that you're making today setting you up for maximizing utility over the arc of your life?
You probably didn't know this, but I spent a number of years at Booz and Co. So
Mm-hmm. So
I
you know
lived
that
that.
world. Yeah.
I know that McKinsey world, and I would always look at the partners thinking some of them had been there 20, 25 years. I was like, how in the world do you do this?
And I would say, as an economist, because of what my utility function is, I would say these people are really poor because they're making a lot of money, but they are traveling 4 or 5 days a week away from their kids, and they're missing a lot of the things that to me really matter in life. And so that to me is not wealth because of my utility function. That might be their utility function, it might be fine, right? But I think when you think about your own values, that's what you want to do. You want to look at the people who have been there for 20 years and you want to say, if I'm investing in building this career, is it a career that I want? Is it ultimately going to pay off in a way that is consistent with my utility function?
Corinne, one of the things you talk about in the book is something that you identify as the squeeze.
Yes.
And to me, this squeeze was something that I think my parents had warned me about, but I didn't really have a terminology for it until I found myself in it. But maybe you could describe for the audience what the squeeze is and how they might understand if they're living in it now or if they've already gone through it.
The way I uncovered the squeeze was starting with the research question of why am I so tired all the time? And I wanted to look at how time use changed over the life cycle. And what I found is that we face this kind of mountain of childcare and housework time when our kids are young, which is typically mid 30s. So it's when you have the maximum number of young kids, like not just one kid, but you have two or three young kids. And it's at the point where we're still investing in our careers, because if you graph income over that same time period, income still has a really steep slope. It's still increasing because you're still investing in your career and it hasn't paid off yet. You have this time where like your time use is at this peak, it's this mountain, but your income hasn't peaked yet. So you can't like throw money at the problem. So you often feel squeezed on both time and money. You feel like I've got to stay at work because I've got to make these career investments, but they're not actually paying me that much yet. So it's not that I can just like hire a nanny and two housekeepers and whatever, a driver to take care of the car, right? I also have to save and be frugal. And like my kids need more than me than from me than at any other point in their lives. And what's ironic about the squeeze is that then both of those things abate within the next 10 years. Within the next 10 years, your career investments start to pay off. So you start to have more money. And the time that your kids need from you really starts to plummet. And then you end up like maybe in your 40s and 50s being like, oh, I have more time now and more money. Why was I so stressed out in those years in the past? And so I guess knowing that you're going to get to the other side of it, to me as an economist who thinks about maximizing utility over the life cycle, it changes the way you approach it. And one of the things that I say is that because the squeeze passes, because it's so temporary, it means that your solutions while you're in it don't have to be sustainable. You can actually do things that you say, yeah, right now we're not going to eat home cooked food. This doesn't mean we're never going to eat home cooked food. And I don't need to, I have this tendency to catastrophize. Like when the house is a mess, I'm like, it's always going to be messy. I'm never going to catch up with it. Right. So no, right now you're in the squeeze. Things might not, things might be a little messy and imperfect. They might not be meeting your ideal. And I even mean that financially, that I even mean that for people with young kids and young careers, it would be better to invest in outsourcing and giving yourself back time and saving a little less, presuming that you are maxing out your 401k match, because that's the only thing you've got to max that out. That's free money, right? But presuming you're maxing out your 401k match, it would be better to actually save less or even take money out of savings to get through the squeeze and invest in your career, because that's going to pay off later.
To summarize, what your research shows in the book is that home demands peak before income does. And
Exactly.
so that intensifies the strain of the
Mm-hmm.
squeeze that people are feeling. So, my question to that is it seems like the squeeze is lasting for many people and longer, regardless if they have the kids who are growing up or not. Have you seen that as well?
I think there's a couple factors there. One thing that I hear about a lot is the demands of aging parents, and that is hitting us earlier in life because of generations getting more stretched out. The fact that we do have kids in our 30s, late 30s, early 40s now means that our parents might be aging before our kids are off on and self independent. And so that's one reason. The other reason is longer career tracks. So careers are asking for more investments. It's not straight out of college to the kind of high paying job, it's from college to more investments. In academia, the example is it used to be that you went straight from college to get your PhD. And now it's college and you do a pre-doc and you get your PhD, and then you do a postdoc, and then finally you have a faculty position. And so that is stretching out that length of that investment period where your job needs your time and the money hasn't paid off yet.
Thinking about that squeeze period, how should couples think about dividing responsibilities in a way that feels fair even as their circumstances change. Because I know this was something that when I had kids, we went through, like trying to think about it, because our kids had a 6 year spread, but they were both involved in different activities. And it got really complicated as they got older, as they were both wanting to do things. And we were both trying to meet their needs and meet our needs and the family needs, etc. You see where I'm going.
Totally. And it is very challenging. And I recommend that couples actually try tracking their time a little bit because it's very hard to divide what you can't see. And often there's a lot of invisible labor in the household. So I actually recommend I have a time tracking tool on my website. If you go to corinnelow.com resources. And I recommend that you get some data in your household of what is all the stuff that's taking up your time, and then have those some of those strategic conversations of, do we want to be spending this much time on this? Is this something we can outsource? If you find that actually I didn't realize it was a huge time sink to do all the meal prep and cleaning out the fridge. Okay, is that something we can outsource? And then are there things that one person needs to take off the other person's plate where, again, we didn't realize that, oh, this is so time consuming that every day you're managing this stream of texts from the teenager and we need to make sure that the teenager texts both of us or whatever, right? So getting some data and then using like the power of economics to understand, are there things that it makes sense to divide because one person is better at it, one person likes it more, right? But there's other areas where nobody really likes it. It's just the grime of everyday life that needs to be done, right? And then you've just got to make sure that like you're both pitching in and it's not, you're not letting some of that labor become invisibilized where just one person does it and the other person takes it for granted. The refilling the toilet paper rolls and refilling the soap dispensers, those are great examples. Tracking your time and getting some of that data, it lets you think, are we aligning our time within the household with our values? And if our values are shared, joint contribution, that's one thing we have to work on. And also, if our values are investing in the things that matter, spending time with people, spending time with investing in our careers, are there ways that we can get some of these things off our plate, either by outsourcing them or some of them even just by letting them go?
So I want to go back, now that we've explained a lot of this, to that analogy that I gave earlier of you're living in a house, you're part of this family unit.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that happens in modern partnerships, and it's something that you highlight in the book, is that they often lack explicit negotiation. So I think what that ends up doing is it ends up, if you think about this in economics, in resource allocation being done in an unfair way. So when that happens, it leads to mismatched expectations and ultimately to resentment, which I think is what causes a lot of the breakups that we see today, or anger or pent up frustration that people have. So, from your standpoint, examining this, how do you think partnerships could do a better job doing these negotiations? Because I think sometimes what we end up in is we get trapped where we're at. So you get
So
trapped
true.
being that person who's the floor, and then
Yeah.
you don't know, how do you go from the floor to being a chair again?
And then sometimes those like where we get trapped in are so those defaults, and those can be gender defaults, for example, where maybe the guy is trapped in this role of feeling like he has to be the breadwinner and go to work for 45 hours a week, but he's miserable and he would rather spend more time with the kids and invest more in her career. But it just ends up because it's such a strong societal default, right? So I think you need to take the time to really have these conversations about, what do you value in life? What's important to you? And are you getting enough of it? Right. And then understanding that the biggest gift you can give somebody is the gift of what they value. It's according to what their needs actually are. So you might think, well, when I come home from a long day of work, what I can do for the household is take the trash out and empty the dishwasher so she doesn't have to worry about it in the morning. But it might actually be that for her, what she wants is a hug and some emotional support when you get home from work, right? So I think you've got to have that explicit conversation because it has to be like, what are your needs and how can we each support one another's needs, and how can we constantly be questioning those societal defaults and instead making really active choices about what roles we're going to play in the household.
Thank you so much for that, Corinne. And last thing I wanted to ask you, because I have heard you talk about this, that you're not the biggest fan of chasing your passion, which when I think of passion struck isn't what the meaning is. I'd love to ask this question for you. Now that I've given that prompt, what does it mean for you to be passion struck?
What I mean by that with not chasing your passion is I mean it specifically in the domain of career, because as I said alluded to earlier, sometimes the thing we're most passionate about isn't going to produce the most utility in our career, because it could be that there's no way to get a good conversion of our time into money in that career area,
Right.
right? So I want people to focus on utility from their jobs and be passionate, but also be practical with their careers. But to be passion struck in life is exactly what I'm talking about, which is that I should feel alive every day because I am doing things that I value. I'm doing things that ultimately matter. In that sense of at the end of my life, that would be a day that mattered, that was filled with goodness, right? That was filled with actual content that I value. And so every day I am passion struck by my children. I am passion struck by my work because I am lucky enough to have work that I'm able to find that kind of value in those sparks of passion in. I'm also passion struck by my volunteer work that I do. I'm someone who chose not to work in a nonprofit field, but I actually run a nonprofit in my spare time because it's something that I'm passionate about, but there was no way to make it financially add up as a career, right? So finding to be for me to be passion struck is finding those moments each day that would go up on the point board at the end of your life. And I want every day to have those moments for you because every day should count.
Corinne, where's the best place people can go if they want to learn more about you and your work?
You can go to my website, CorinneLow.com. You can follow me on Instagram, Corinne Low PhD. And of course, you can pick up Having It All wherever you get your books. It's in hardcover, it's in ebook. You can also get an audiobook if you're somebody who likes to listen while you're at the gym or you're taking a walk, to go see your friends, to do something that you value, something that, brings you utility. And I hope that people will stay in touch.
Awesome. Corinne, it was such an honor to have you today. Thank you so much for joining us on Passion Struck.
Thanks, John.